Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. I'm delighted to have Onwurah with me, who has taken time out from parliamentary business. Chi is the Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital, so of immediate interest to this college, and was an elected MP in 2010. But I'd like to start off by talking about her early life. I should just say that unlike some of my guests, Chi's diary is very constrained, so we will have Q&A at the end, and do put questions in the Q&A function as we go along, but we will end sharp at 6 so that she can get to her next appointment. So welcome, thank you for coming. What got you interested in the STEM subjects in the first place? You're muted. Sorry, you're muted.
Let me say that. Let me start by saying what a great pleasure it is to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I think this is the first time I've been interviewed by an eminent physicist, so that is in itself a great pleasure. And it's the question about what got me first interested in science and STEM is one I've kind of grappled with over the years of being an engineer and of being a politician. And I think, you know, I was interested in science and engineering from about the age of 7 or 8. I got a microscope for my 8th birthday and a chemistry set for my 9th. And the big question for me was whether I'd do science or engineering. So I think what inspired me was a combination of, you know, I grew up in Newcastle in the northeast, where engineering and sort of science was highly respected. I remember visiting the Science Museum in Newcastle and seeing an exhibition which was the Turbinia, which was the first steam turbine ship. It showed the insides of that. This is, you know, it was the iPhone of its day, which was the late Victorian era, and just being sort of fascinated by how beautiful it was and also how it worked. And I think it was really that. And I remember looking at sort of electricity plugs at home, and, you know, how does the electricity get in there? And I do think it was a sort of respect for engineering and science, and a desire to know how the world works, which really inspired me. And just to try and so I remember, you know, we didn't have scientists or engineers really on the council estate where I was growing up. But I remember learning about Archimedes at primary school. Again, was about 9, and I went home and filled the kitchen sink with water, and then tried to see how many things I could put in it, and they would float. And when my mum asked me what on earth I was doing, I said I was a scientist, you know, as was Archimedes, and she should be glad, you know, I hadn't. Who dashed through the streets naked, and at least I was still in nice wearing my clothes.
So your parents weren't scientists or engineers themselves?
No, I don't. I mean, my father was a doctor. That's how he came. He's from Nigeria. He was from Nigeria, and he came to Newcastle to study. But we had returned. I was born in Newcastle, in Wallsend actually, and then we went to Nigeria in 1967, just before the outbreak of the Biafran War. So my mum and us, my brother and sister, we came back from Biafra actually as Biafran sort of refugees. And my father was in the Biafran army. So he wasn't around when I was growing up, and I honestly can't say that he influenced my career choices. And my mum was not a scientist, or, you know, not really. I have to say she wasn't really inspired by science, but she was very certain that we should all do what we wanted to do and to promote our interests wherever they were. And so I think it was more about what was part of, you know, I think it's unique to everyone, but it was what was part of the sort of local culture, as well as just what I was interested in.
And your school could provide good education in these subjects. I know often schools don't have good physics teachers, for instance, because there just aren't enough to go round.
And in some ways, that's what was so. Rockland, my primary school had a maths teacher who really inspired me when it came to maths. As did my secondary school, Kenton Comprehensive School in Newcastle, and yeah, I ended up doing further maths and physics, and we had a really good physics teacher, really good further maths and further maths. And this was sort of the late 70s, the early 80s, and there was a real, I will say that, the school was very, was very invested in supporting all its students, and I just wish that more schools had those sort of resources available today. And I think there has been a reduction in the investment and the support for schools in this area. As well as
I was talking to someone earlier today who was a trustee of one of the local school trusts, and she was saying that what really interested her about that school was they had a commitment that teachers had to have a degree in the subject they were teaching. And it seems such a minimal requirement, and yet there are many schools that haven't got people who can teach physics or further maths or something with a solid background, and it must be very difficult for them as well as for their pupils.
Well, so I chair the all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM. I mean, it is one of the things that I'm really passionate about. So all-party parliamentary groups are MPs from all parties and peers from the House of Lords as well, who come together about something they're passionate about. And we did a recent report about education and diversity and inclusion in STEM. One of the things that it found, is the importance of teachers, and particularly because where there are cultural barriers, and particularly for women and girls entering STEM, having a teacher who is inspired by that subject and can pass on that inspiration is more important. And so, yes, having a background in that helps. But today, it is more. There are many different other options for those who have a degree in physics than teaching physics, for example, and equally further maths. So that's why we need to have more support for the teachers. It's hard to inspire children in a subject with which you feel uncertain yourself.
Absolutely. And what about your Nigerian heritage? How did that impact on your upbringing?
Well, it was. It was challenging in many ways, as much as my father was absent. We had, and my mother was disabled, so we grew up with very little money. And again, this was a time when it was you were able to museums, etc., visits, things like that were free and subsidized. And it was really important that I was able to get, which I know many that those students listening to this today will be amazed at, but I got a full grant to go and study engineering at Imperial. And I think, my Nigerian heritage, it really, a lot of I faced a lot of sort of stereotypes and basically racism, like mainly racism, focused on my skin color and my Nigerian heritage, which were really isolating, particularly at university. At Imperial at that time was, and I've said this to them, and they told me it's changed. So I know it's changed, but there was a lot. There was both the students and the teaching and the professors. There was a lot of racism, and at one point actually that made me think about leaving the course, the engineering course, because if this was what engineering was like, it wasn't what I wanted to be part of. The combination of misogyny and racism is not particularly attractive. But I'm very much, and there wasn't the support there. There wasn't the support for students at that time either. And I'm sure that I know that you're responsible for making sure that's not the case at Churchill College. So I think it was. It was a real kind of barrier and a real source of pain, actually, a lot of the time. But the other point I would also say, though, is that when eventually I went to work in Nigeria to build out Nigeria's first GSM network in the early 2000s, it was incredibly. It was like it was quite wonderful to be working in an environment with which I had such close family connections, and to be that was the only time in which only time being part of an all Black engineering team, and that was also very empowering.
So what enabled you to get through and not quit your course at Imperial?
Well, there were no. I don't even think. I'm not even sure we had a women's network at Imperial. Never mind an anti-racist network. I think it was pig stubbornness and pig-headedness, basically, in the end, which is not a bad reaction to obstacles. I will say I didn't want what I did in life to be decided by people with small minds and little experience, and so I and also the support of family and friends, which is really important at any time. And I had my sort of eyes sort of fixed on the idea that once I left university, I know in the context which I'm saying this, once I left university, it would be a lot better out in the real world, out in the working world. It's one of the reasons why I was so was not going to go and do a master's, and it's true, it was better. I think I think for me, engineering was I wanted to be an engineer because I wanted to change things. I wanted to make things work. I wanted to make things work better. I wanted to understand how things work. And so once I was actually in a job doing that, it was fantastic. It was great. So
you encountered less prejudice in the workplace than at Imperial?
Very much, yes. Very much. Much less overt prejudice. I mean, at Imperial, we had the ragmag was actually full of racist jokes, and I remember my lecturer, who came from South Africa, would make jokes about hitting us with I forget what it was, a particular South African whip, actually. So that was very much in your face, and I'd say that in my first company I worked for was a company called Northern Telecom, which is a Canadian American company, which had very sort of the culture about supporting people. I mean, it still meant that I experienced, I remember particularly conferences, on ISDN, for example, very, technical conferences, but in the evening, the conversation would always somehow manage to include racist jokes. And so I wouldn't hang around in the evening, or would try to avoid dinners and things like that. Because I think one of these challenges is that, speaking up and those sort of, the 21, 22-year-old, you feel very difficult to challenge. But then if you don't challenge it, you sort of feel bad and complicit as well. And so that was, that was difficult. I think with time, I sort of realized that firstly, it wasn't necessarily my job to challenge it, but also that if you're in a culture where if your boss or your boss's boss, if you have the support, then you can challenge, then it's much easier to challenge. And also if you have some kind of support network, like a network of women or a Black engineers network, then it can be sort of challenged, constructively or without your direct involvement. So I think that's what every culture needs to have. And I'm talking about political culture and organizational culture, needs to have a way of challenging and a way of blowing the whistle on the kind of sexism and racism that you can encounter. Also, I think it's really important to have, what I think the Americans call allies. Every apart from maybe one or two times when I was working in Nigeria, for example, every boss I ever had as an engineer was a white man. Some were hugely supportive, and I'm really grateful, supportive both in professional terms, but also in terms of dealing with sort of challenges from misogyny or racism or anti-northerner bias as a good working class girl from Newcastle, whatever, some are really supportive and some weren't.
That is always a problem. And I mean, you say it's difficult to challenge when you're 21 or 22. I actually think it's difficult to challenge at practically any age, if you are isolated and no one else is going to stick up for you. And I think this idea of, well, men as allies when it is a case of sexism, I think it's hugely important. And I agree with you. You use the word complicit. If you don't speak up, I mean, I don't actually think if the victim doesn't speak up, they're complicit so much. But if other people see it and don't say that's not appropriate, I think they are complicit. And I think a lot of people think doing nothing is acceptable. And I've increasingly come to think it really isn't.
I think that's really true. And I think people can think, you know, like that it's for the victim to speak up. But it is hard for the victim to speak up, and it can be immensely empowering if somebody else speaks up, and then the victim can add their voice to it. Yes. So I think that's really important.
And at the very least, I think speaking up afterwards, cornering the chair of the committee or whatever afterwards, and asking the victim if they're okay. I think, you know, both those are much better than doing nothing. And there are situations where it's really hard for anyone to intervene, I think, but I think one can always try and pick up pieces later.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I did have actually quite a good experience of that. I went back to Manchester Business School to do a master's, and I remember challenging something there. And maybe it's also being older. I think it can be easier when you're older, but had a really good supportive response from the organisation, and that made me feel more empowered to do it in the future. I think now as a member of Parliament, you know, part of my job is to challenge. So it's like I try not to let anything go by. But I think you're right that it can be challenging at any age, just to especially when you feel it's part of the culture that is around you.
Yes, and that you won't be supported. I mean, I think that's the scary thing. What are you going to gain except a reputation for being this tiresome person? And, you know.
Yes, troublemaker.
Yes, I'm sure you and I have both been accused of a lot of things. So you actually did electrical engineering. Is that right? That was your degree as well as what you went on to do?
Electrical and electronic engineering at Imperial, yes.
And why electrical engineering? What was special about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's because, so like I said, I think I knew from the age of 7 or 8 that I wanted to do some kind of science, and it was what to do. And I'll be honest with you, in many ways, I wanted to build spaceships. It was, I was kind of interested in trains or sort of, but no, actually wanted to build spaceships. And so, and also I wanted to do things which would make a difference that I could see. So electrical engineering, whether at that time, whether it was computing or circuit boards, control systems, all that seemed to be a lot about what the world was going to be about, and I wanted to be part of it. So part of me wanted to build the computer from 2001, and part of me just wanted, if I couldn't do that, then I thought I'd be happy building computers or systems that would change the world for the better.
Yeah, and computing is one of those areas, possibly even more so than engineering, that has a lack of diversity.
It is. I mean, it's ironic in a way that it is possibly the least diverse. So I think that in your area, sort of parts of physics, and it's highly ironic, given that the first computer or the first computer scientist was Ada Lovelace. So I always say, women started off with 100% of the global computing talent, and we're being very reasonable in just aiming to get back to 50%.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough. And I think it's the Institute for Electrical Engineers which has this slogan, 9% is not enough, referring to the number of women in that workforce or their membership. It has gone up a bit, I think, that since then. It might be 12%.
It might be 12%. But I think it's not enough, and it's not acceptable. And it's one of the, when I was at Imperial, I think it was 12% of those on my course were women. And I think now on our engineering courses, I think over like 25 years, it may have gone up exactly to 14 or 15%. It's just one of the reasons why I get so angry when I read talks about intergenerational change or the need to improve the pipeline. All of that is true, but also we need a real sense of urgency about change now, because we have been waiting and not changing for so very long, and all the time there are technology is so pervasive throughout all our lives, and yet that technology is not designed by people who represent us, who represent humanity, and as a necessity, necessarily that means it is not humane. And I just think that we lose in the technology that we have. Not being so many examples from some facial recognition technology that can't recognize black faces, to health apps that don't recognize that that you might have had a period. We lose in terms of the technology that we have, but we also lose in terms of the technology that we don't have. We don't know what technology would have been designed by all the different diverse sort of people that we are effectively excluding from being part of this great revolution in how we live and work and play. And so it is a matter of urgency that we change engineering, that we change science, so that we are more diverse and more representative.
But some people will just say, I remember having this said to me on the day program by a female head teacher who said, oh, well, girls just don't like to do physics. And you think, yeah, I mean, this was after I was talking about an Institute of Physics report which showed how many more girls did physics A-level in single-sex schools compared with co-educational. And yet, many people believe that somehow there's something intrinsic, that we are born not liking physics. And, I find this remarkable. So much of what is happening is cultural.
Absolutely. It's really funny. I got that actually a couple of years ago at a party I was at, and from a physics teacher, male physics teacher, and the poor male physics teacher, he wasn't allowed to move for half an hour whilst I explained to, just some of the many examples. I mean, for example, under Soviet rule or influence, the Eastern Bloc of countries had almost gender parity when it came to engineers and scientists. And that wasn't that it wasn't that those women were less feminine or less female. The idea that girls just don't like to do physics makes you and I into some kind of freaks who just did want to do physics. And thank you very much, but I'm not a freak. And then the other example was is that in India, which has a much higher literacy rate for boys than for girls because of biases and prejudices in education, still manages to have a much higher proportion of girls who do computing and science and in engineering. And it's about what is sort of culturally seen as being good to aspire to. So it's not. Yeah, it's not about the way our brains are wired. It's about the way society's culture is wired. And I'm intensely sensitive to anything that puts the blame on girls. Even the way that language is used to say, it's like that girls are making the wrong choices. When we have a culture free of sexism and misogyny, then we can decide what choices, and we can see what choices are really being made.
I totally agree with you. And I know you've been involved with that Toys Be Toys, which, I believe the problems start just about at birth. And the kinds of toys that boys and girls are given to play with, and the way they are able to develop hand-eye coordination or whatever. Barbie just doesn't have the same effect as Mikado. And I get hammered for saying Barbie's not such a great thing, but give the boys Barbie and give the girls Meccano for a change, and let's see what happens.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And when I was a kid, Lego, for example, which I loved, it came in, I think, red and blue and white and green, and girls and boys played with it.
And I mean, there's an advertisement from the 1970s in a Lego box which says, essentially, parents, don't limit your children's imagination.
Yeah,
girls do want to build spaceships like you, and it's a shame we've gone backwards. It's all marketing.
It is, and it really has. It really has gone backwards in terms of the pink and the blue was not part of the kind of gender, such a absolute gender division that it is now, and that is that is pre-marketing. And equally, also, blue was at one point a symbol for girls because of the Virgin Mary, I think it was. So it is purely marketing, but it creates such it creates such a division at a time when girls and boys are sort of not coming to terms, but trying to understand what their identity and their gender is or might mean. It says it means one thing and not another, and also that this idea that girls prefer the caring professions when what is more caring than delivering clean water to those who don't have it, or what I try to do, which was build out networks that people could come with, people could bring people together. It's kind of like the stereotypes of sort of toys in childhood, so then feed into professions, when then that feeds back into the stereotypes childhood. So it's a vicious circle, and that's again why we actually we need real action to break that cycle of continual gender demarcation for engineering or for the professions. We need real action now to break that, and then we can see what we can do with sort of over the steady state. We're in an exception mode, and that's we need to see real change.
What can be done? Because one of the things I think is very depressing, to go back to the Institute of Physics, and I'm sure the engineering professional bodies have been doing the same thing. They've tried interventions and they haven't been very successful. As you say, the numbers of women on engineering courses hasn't changed significantly over a long time. Legislation, I mean, technically there are barriers. So what do you think needs to be done?
I'm so glad you asked me that. We have as a Labour politician and shadow minister for science and digital. I think part of the issue is to think that, or the challenge is to think that it's a problem that can just be solved with one thing, or only one thing. Cultural change is the hard. Anyone who's worked in an organisation, cultural change is the hardest change to bring about. And that is part of what we need to achieve, as well as it's a culmination of other issues in our society. So the way in which we value different sort of aspects of employees in terms of those who can valuing those who can shout more about themselves perhaps than those. There are so many different elements, if you like, and the absence, I would also say the absence of real lifelong learning. So like I say, I knew what I wanted to do from the age of about 9. Now, everybody makes the right choices when they're 14, but once you're sort of 21, 22, you're not really entitled to free education in this country anymore, and you're certainly not entitled to be re-educated in something new. So but I think so you need to look at it each way from the top in terms of leadership, and I would set diversity charters for every sector with targets which the sector could set itself, but then with penalties for not meeting those targets. I would also ensure that that funding for research reflected, for example, the success of academics and institutions in ensuring that diversity. I would champion and promote organizations and leadership which are making a difference, which are doing things better, as well as calling out those who aren't. And I do think, I think we need to reflect on the fact that professions which are female, such as tend to be less well paid, and that contributes to the gender pay gap. And so, for example, which is something that we need to address as well. But for example, one of the things that annoys me about some of the big tech companies, one of the many things that annoys me about some of the big tech companies like Facebook or Google, but if you go visit them, that you'll find that their engineering teams lack diversity, but their canteen, the staff who work in the canteen are very diverse, but they won't take, but that's usually outsourced to some other organization, and they won't take responsibility for either integrating and giving opportunities to grow and change. So there are, I think, in many ways where proactive government with a strong leadership in business and academia can really make a difference here.
And you talk about targets. What are your view about quotas? It's a question I'm often asked.
Well, I also think I think it was Christine Lagarde who said that quotas, she hated them, she didn't agree with them, she didn't think they were right, we had to have them. I mean, I'm not quite sure I'm there yet. I would start off with targets. Mm-hmm. I would start off with targets, but in the clear sort of sense of urgency that this is not something we can wait another 25 years to make a change happen. So let's have targets and move towards that. I think the idea. So I was selected for Newcastle on an all-women shortlist, which was a policy that Labour brought in. I think it was 2005. It might have been to because otherwise Harriet Harman had calculated that at the rate of change of women in Parliament, we would be 2,300 before there was gender parity in Westminster. So we brought in all-women shortlist, which is in Newcastle Central was one. But I might well have been selected without an all-women shortlist. But interestingly, I probably wouldn't have put myself forward for it. Because I didn't actually know how the system, I didn't know how it worked. I didn't have a clear signal that the Labour Party was really looking for change, and that all women shortlist was a clear signal of that. And so that's why I think that's one of what we need to do in science and engineering is to send clear signals that only change is acceptable, and chart the charters with clear. With targets and measurement against those targets would be, for me, step one.
Do you think, therefore, it would be possible to have a sort of option whereby, I mean, it used to be that women returners, if you like, would come back and do a degree. I mean, it might have been in English, but I mean, do you think you could have a way of having a target of women returners coming back and doing an engineering degree? Because otherwise, how are we going to get beyond where we are now with a low supply?
I think that's a really good point. It's also, I mean, it's about gender diversity, but it's also about the structural changes that we're going to see in work. As certain skills are less valuable because of automation, and certain sectors have less jobs because of the fourth industrial revolution, automation, the shift of retail from high street to online. So we need to have a comprehensive, effective way of retraining or new training for, with engineering skills. And so the last election we talked about a national education service, But I know that the current government has a lifelong skills, but it seems to be quite low level skills, as it were. I think we definitely need to be able to support women and others going into engineering later in life.
Yes, I mean, was it Bayes that had the advertisement of a picture of a ballerina saying your next job may be in cyber? It didn't quite explain how you were going to get from one to the other.
How you were going to get for it, and also it didn't make it clear that that's what she wanted to do, or that was what she was forced to do, because the government was going to slash all the funding for the arts, which is not what we want. It's not what we want. It's not what we want either. But by championing and making those pathways, making those pathways available. There's a lot of detailed work that needs to be done there to make those pathways available. They're not available now. People who are, returnees are less likely to spend if they are able to take a £40,000 loan in order to do an engineering degree. So we have to make sure those pathways are there. And I think it's true, I think that that we're keeping women. I speak as someone who left engineering to go into politics, but I use engineering like politics. But keeping women in STEM is also really important. And we see that even in the sciences, sort of the biological sciences, which have got a much greater gender balance, through the career pathways, through the hierarchy, that levels off, and there aren't the ways to keep women in science as well. There aren't the key support to keep women in science as well.
No, and I mean, certainly in academic science, I can't talk about industry, but in academic science, I think women still are not exactly pushed out, but the lack of support that you described, I think absolutely many women would still recognize that. Absolutely.
So the short-term contractism, and I always say, that the gig economy seems to have begun in academia before it made its way into transport or whatever. That short-term contracts that effectively discriminates against women, discriminates against those from lower income backgrounds who can't be supported, and it discriminates against those who don't have the network that you need to be always getting onto your next project. So I think that is. And I know I spoke. That is a challenge. How do we ensure that longer term career paths are there? Or career security, actually, employment security is there, particularly for women.
You've talked about degrees. I'm quite interested in technical pathways as well. That sorry, have you got a crisis?
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, my battery just decided. Part of the solution is always to plug it in. It's just running on its battery, so I just need to plug it.
Okay, so you're fine.
Issue which I solved.
So I'm interested in the technical pathways too, because I mean, there's a lot of talk about levelling up, and the Northeast, of course, will be one of the places that will want to be levelled up, I'm sure. But some of those jobs perhaps aren't at degree level. They may be, what I think of as HND, I don't know, level 4, level 5 kind of qualifications. Do you think that's a way of, both levelling up and encouraging diversity?
I think that's a great question. I think we need sort of apprenticeships and further education. Has been starved of investment, and whilst it has been fiddled with, I'll put it that way, whether it's apprenticeship levy or in degree, I've seen people in Newcastle, people on degree apprenticeships. It hasn't addressed the fundamental problem that we no longer have the kind of large companies who would take on 1,000 apprentices on a 3-year apprenticeship, at the end of which they've got a sort of a good job in engineering. And so the answer to the question is, I do think that apprenticeships and further education have to be a real part of the sort of the new economy. I don't particularly like the phrase levelling up, partly because I do think it's all about talk and it's not really about any actual delivery, but getting good jobs, good jobs which come, for example, in the Northeast from from green energy. The jobs, for example, which would come from changing over every home in the country from a gas heater to a heat pump or a green energy source. Those are, hundreds of thousands of good jobs. But we need an industrial strategy which makes that happen, and then we need the investment in the skills so that happens, and that needs to make sure that so the last time I looked at this, I don't know if it's still true, 12% of electrical engineers are women. Electricians, it was 1%.
Well, the people who come into your home to
yes.
Rewire your house or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, it was 1%. So there's huge, you can say in some ways there's huge opportunity there to address those kind of good not degree but level jobs. But we need an industrial strategy as well as the investment in further education to do that.
Yeah, and at the moment, I get the sense that HE and FE are being pitted against each other instead of being seen as part of the ecosystem together.
Well, we could talk about this for a long time, but the marketization of higher education and further education, so the shift from a kind of universities and colleges have always been autonomous and not public services, but education was considered a public good, to becoming a market with consumers, and therefore where educational help compete against each other, and also between HE and FE, and there are been some sort of benefits in making, I think, academic institutions more responsive to students. But I also think that it's really missing out a big sector of young people who need the opportunities that further education provides, but which are not being not there anymore.
And I think, so research relies on a lot of people, some of whom are don't need to be qualified to PhD level, and yet somehow research is seen as being this sort of elite kind of thing.
That's really, really damaging. And again, I think the government is, I've had this tried to have discussion with ministers, but by talking about sort of as being what we want to attract with our visa regime, it ignores the fact that, science is a collaborative, science and engineering, but I think, but to undermine the stereotypes, activity, not about one.
Sorry, can you come closer? You're sort of fading.
So science is a collaborative activity, and it's not about one genius scientist. It's about a whole team of people who that includes technicians and who work together to bring about fundamental change and discoveries. And so some of the policies around the levels of income you need to have a visa, for example, to come into this country, are really counterproductive in that regard. As well as the other thing I think is really puts young people off is the idea that you need to be like a brilliant scientist in order to to go into science. We want to attract brilliance, but there's also a huge contribution that people can make with all with different levels of as part of a team.
And I think this idea of, it's particularly true, I think, of physics again, that you have to be really, really smart, puts young girls off at 12 kind of thing. I don't want to be like that. I believe it's true in economics and philosophy too, this idea that these are subjects you have to be really smart at. And then it's very off-putting.
It is, and I really, the media kind of I see it constantly in media representations of science and scientists. The kind of sort of individual genius stereotype, or B, the idea that any sort of scientific explanation is going to be too difficult for the interviewer to comprehend. And it's not. Science is something can't be something. This is why I talk about wanting us to have an innovation nation. Science cannot be something that happens in some tower sort of somewhere else. It has to be something that we all can be part of and we could all contribute to. I don't want us a nation of consumers of technology and science. We need to be a nation of contributors, and that, creators indeed. And that, that is the way that the United Kingdom can compete and be strong and independent on a global scene, post all the geopolitical changes that we won't necessarily want to get into discussing. But yeah.
No, probably not. I'm conscious of the time, so can I remind the audience, please type in your questions. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions. So there's one typed in already, which you've explained that you became a politician in 2010, but the question is, did you plan to go into politics, or was it something that gradually happened via community work or representing people and issues at work?
That's a really interesting question, and I heard the short answer is no. I didn't plan to go into politics. I remember, like, at the age of sort of 9 and 10, I think, or 10, watching politicians on TV. Yeah, and thinking what a great job it would be to represent, Newcastle Central, where I was growing up, and the people I cared about. And I'm very proud of being from Newcastle, where it would be a fantastic job to do that. But I didn't feel, the politicians didn't look like me, they didn't sound like me, and actually, in terms of diversity at that point, politicians were almost all men. But I was always very, interested in politics, and I joined the Labour Party when I was 16, and I was actually elected as the Member of Parliament for Kenton School, my school, in a mock election when I was 17. And so, I think one of the other things is I thought that I was kind of interested in it, but I thought if I was going to become an MP, somebody would sort of, there'd be some big hand which would come down from the sky and say, you should be an MP. I did not know what the process was. As active in politics as I was in the Labour Party, I didn't know what the process is. And the truth is, isn't just one process. So it was when the Member of Parliament for Newcastle Central, so the place I grew up with, announced he was going to retire at the 2010 election, that I thought, well, if there's any opportunity for me to represent the people I grew up with, that's what I want to do. And then, I found out about Onwurah shortlists and the process, which, just for those who might want to know, in the Labour Party at least, is that you are selected by local Labour Party members. And then, I put myself forward. You have to put yourself forward. That's another sort of life lesson. Often you have to put yourself forward. I put myself forward, and the Labour members of Newcastle Central had the, I don't know what you call it, but anyway, they selected me, they chose me, and that's when in 2009, and then I stood in 2010 and I was elected. So it was not a sort of career plan, but it was always something I was interested in. I also think it's really important to be open to that kind of change. I started off as a hardware engineer. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I went to Imperial to learn to do. But over the years, I became a software engineer, and then I became a network engineer, and then I became a product manager. And being open to using your skills in different ways is I think, well, for me, it's something that makes your work really satisfying, because you're changing and growing. It's never too late to change. And so, I found the idea of standing for Parliament really daunting. But I thought it was better to be daunted than not to try.
I think this idea that you set out to say when you went to Imperial or whatever, and you know exactly what you want to do, and you've got your life mapped out. And it's something I tend to say in the matriculation dinner speech to the students in college, don't assume that you know how your life is going to work out at all, because it won't. And do be willing to seize opportunities. And that's exactly how you describe things, really, that things arise and you take them, and you don't let them daunt you.
Yeah, and just an example of that, I was working for an American .com company in 2000 in the US in Vienna, Virginia, which went into Chapter 11 with the .com bust there. And I was in the US on a visa which was about to expire or whatever. And in the US, when you lose your job, you get 2 weeks notice of that. And it was one of the worst experiences of my life. But having said that, it was actually one of the most interesting and strengthening experiences ultimately, because I learned a lot about bankruptcy proceedings, and I learned a lot about economics, and I also learned a lot about myself from it. So I think it is being able to take the things that are thrown at you, and I think resilience is the kind of the greatest sort of quality that you can have to be successful in a difficult world.
Now, there's a question come in: why are there so few scientists who are politicians?
Well, that's a great question. But I want to say to you, those listening, when I told my engineering and scientist friends that I was standing for Parliament, they were almost to a woman and man horrified that I was going to dirty my rational professional, I was at chartered hands in the mess which is sort of politics. And so I think the answer to that question is, partially, Parliament politics can be difficult to get in, and it can be obscure how you enter it, and that anyone who's you're interested, who's watching or listening to this, who's interested in politics, and then please do get in touch in terms of support on how you do it. But it's also got to be a recognition that politics is everywhere. What decides how much the science budget, which is something I have discussions with the government about regularly, that is politics. What decides the regulation of sort of telecommunications, which determines who gets access to what spectrum, that is politics. Politics is, a lot of what we do, and I think that more scientists and engineers should be considering politics, and I think that politics should be more open to scientists and engineers. There are a lot of lawyers in the House. Lawyers are good, but I think there certainly needs to be more diversity in politics.
And of course, Cambridge did have Julian Huppert for 5 years. Julian at the time was on secondment from the physics department here. And I found that very interesting watching him. But when I give talks about careers, I frequently say to PhD students, think about policy, going into Whitehall, because there aren't enough civil servants who are scientists, let alone MPs. And I think we really do need that. Again, it's diversity of thought, recognizing the problems, and so many of the problems that the citizenry cares about are embedded in science. We really need that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's a really good point. I'd be interested to know what the reactions of your students are when you suggest that. But it's as well as sort of Whitehall and policy making, Parliament has all the committees, and some of you may have been watching Dominic Cummings at the Science Select Committee. All the committees have and need the support of people who understand the subjects, and so there is, and there's a Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and ensuring that members of Parliament are well informed in these sort of decisions which are being made. Like in the pandemic, COVID has made that, sort of brought that really into focus. But a lot of other policy areas, whether it's digital or food, the Department for Environment, education, a lot of policy areas are highly dependent on science, on evidence and data and scientific understanding, and that is a real kind of there's a real lack, I think, of that. I think that's absolutely right, and that's right. A scientific training and understanding can prepare you for so many different careers, and certainly politics and policy should be part of that.
So just one final question. Do you think you witness a lot of imposter syndrome among women in both science and politics? Is it more visible in those fields?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. It's one of the reasons why I went into that, one of the things I loved about engineering and science, as someone who, as a woman of color from the Northeast, was that I just felt, and not only did I feel this, but I proved this, that it didn't matter what people thought about you, either the circuit board worked or the code worked or it didn't. That was a rational kind of judgment of you. So I made sure my circuit boards worked and my code worked, and that was if you like success. So I think, and I love that about engineering and science. I think once you get sort of like into a management role, then yes. And I think I felt in science and engineering, and I sort of felt that imposter syndrome, or just simply excluded. I remember sitting in a managerial meeting as an engineer, the only woman there, of course, and all the language was taken from public school sport, So it was all about bowling a googly. There was something about, I remember, about a hospital pass. There was always a bit of sailing, running something up the flag, or whatever, And so I realized that people, weren't trying to exclude me, but I felt really excluded. So I don't think that's not imposter syndrome, or but that is about feeling on the outside of something and not part of something. So I think that was certainly, they certainly had a lot of that in engineering and science. In Parliament, there is a sense. I think, I was so somewhat overwhelmed at being elected a member of Parliament, and in some ways, if you didn't feel some imposter syndrome, I know you mean this in a gender way, but to be representing the hopes and ambitions of a 200,000, 125,000 people, that is a rightly daunting task. So I would say, I think there's less imposter syndrome in Parliament, because most politicians, we have to learn to speak up for ourselves. That is our job, if you like. But it's a really interesting question. There are different challenges, I think, in being a woman MP. And I think, for example, the level of vitriol on social media, which women parliamentarians and women of color in particular, Diane Abbott has more than anyone else. That is a real, that's very off-putting as well.
Well, I'm sorry we're going to leave on a slightly sad note. I mean, yes, let's not get into social media.
No, we mustn't leave. I didn't realize it was 6 o'clock or you mustn't leave on a negative. I think one of the things I would say, though, actually, just on that, is one of the greatest joys of going into Parliament has been finding myself surrounded by women MPs, and the support and kind of sisterhood, which I never experienced in engineering, because I was never surrounded by women engineers. I know, and I do hope that's one of the things which, with networks, etc., that is changing. But there is like a real sense of sisterhood amongst women parliamentarians of all parties. Not all, but most of them, and that is really, and that is really positive. And I think we're all looking to make sure that we have a more diverse Parliament, as well as a more diverse engineering and science.
Yes, well, let us hope that we see that come to pass. We really should want it. So thank you so much for doing this. It's been fascinating.
It's been great. Thank you very much as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.